Welcome to another episode of Foreword, the podcast series brought to you by ISS ESG, the responsible investment arm of Institutional Shareholder Services. I'm Mara Souders, Communications Lead at ISS ESG. Today we'll hear from my colleagues, Justine Muller, Analyst for ISS ESG, and Erin Levey, Vice President of Client Services for ISS ESG's Asia-Pacific operations. This episode is dedicated to exploring the issue of modern slavery, which is of particular relevance for my colleagues in the Asia-Pacific region, as almost 3/4 of modern slavery occurs in the Indo-Pacific area. Stay tuned as Justine and Erin discuss modern slavery at length, including why it's crucial to analyze modern slavery from a gender-focused perspective. Our guests will also outline the tools offered by ISS ESG that are available for investors that wish to prioritize the issue of modern slavery. Without further ado, let's hear from Justine and Erin.
Hi, my name is Justine Muller, and I work for the ESG research team here at ISS.
Hello, my name is Erin Levey, and I am the VP of Client Services ESG Asia Pacific for ISS.
We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting both the economy and healthcare systems worldwide. And addressing these impacts are very much a focus of governments, businesses, investors, and communities around the world, and rightfully so. However, those at the bottom of the supply chains are disproportionately at risk of being severely impacted by the pandemic. This is why the need for companies and investors to examine and address modern slavery and labor exploitation in supply chains is becoming even more critical, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Ultimately, this has been a hot topic in the responsible investment space for some time, especially here in Australia and in the UK due to the modern slavery legislation. Before we delve into what implications this has for investors, can you, Erin, please explain what exactly modern slavery is and what the scale of the problem is both globally and here in Australia?
Sure, thanks, Justine. So modern slavery describes situations where offenders use coercion, threats, deception to exploit victims and undermine their freedom. There's a distinction between what was abolished slavery, which constitutes the legal ownership of a person, where modern slavery accounts for illegal control of a person, and it is institutionalized control. So it's a company making a decision to hold an employee to a particular standard, or it's incentivized by government corruption because of the profitability. So those practices can include human trafficking, slavery, servitude, forced labour, debt bondage, forced marriage, worse forms of child labour, and deceptive recruiting or labour practices. The most widely used statistic from the Global Slavery Index estimates 40 million people the victims of modern slavery. In 2016 and 17, 1,900 estimated victims of slavery and human trafficking occurred in Australia. 15.4 million people were living in a forced marriage to which they had not consented, and 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery were children.
Can you give us a little bit more detail on why companies should address this and what they are already doing and how governments are involved?
Sure. But this is an important issue for companies, particularly companies with complex supply chains and that rely on the supply of labour, products and other services, from a global supply chain. There are particularly high-risk sectors across a lot of industries, and there's been a fairly limited approach to managing supply chain risk and modern slavery risk. There's a lot of impacts that are very specific from a company perspective. Supply chains are becoming increasingly global and complex. Companies are increasingly exposed to business risks stemming from human rights issues associated with their supply chain. And those risks include earning volatility, earning sustainability, brand impact, business disruption from social unrest and industrial action, impacts to productivity, and then regulatory risk, as well as the commercial risk and trust factors. It's also increasingly embedded in global norms. So It's been 4 years since all UN member states reached an agreement on Sustainable Development Goals, one of which, SDG 8.7, aims to eradicate modern slavery. With this act, more clients and stakeholders are asking questions related to modern slavery. It's important to understand the nuance of the issue to be able to communicate, and investors need to look at their portfolio and use tools available, engagement, divestment, to manage their supply chain risk and their modern slavery risk. And in particular, coming from a global norms perspective into a regulatory perspective, the UK Modern Slavery Act set in legislation, and Australia has a similar piece of legislation that, demands that companies manage these issues.
Thank you, Erin. That was very interesting. And can you tell us a little bit more about what is important for investors to consider when it comes to modern slavery? How should they engage with companies?
First of all, it's already clear that investors increasingly care about this issue because they see it as a clear risk to their long-term investment strategy, but also because their clients are asking those questions. Consumers are particularly savvy and they want to understand what they purchase and where their money is spent in terms of their investments. They understand and want to know more about how clothes are made. They want companies with sustainable earnings, with a business model that doesn't rely on modern slavery or criminal activity. So it is an ethical and a values-based issue, but it's also a business and investment decision. Many investors don't expect companies to take a legalistic approach, but they want evidence and commitment from the top. The modern slavery statement is not seen as a compliance exercise, but it's a process to influence cultural change, and collaborations are expected. There are a number of different risk indicators that investors can look at. Firstly, the sector and industry of the company. For example, certain operations require the use of unskilled temporary or seasonal labour. The sectors where exploitation occurs are highly gendered, with men and boys more likely to be exploited in construction, manufacturing and agriculture, and women more likely to be exploited in domestic work and sex work. So the means of coercion are also dependent on whether the victim is male or female. In terms of products and services, particularly high-risk goods include rice, spices, tea, coffee, cocoa and cotton. And it's also dependent on where a company operates. As I said before, there's a lot of corruption at a government level, and around 70% of modern slavery occurs in the Indo-Pacific area. So in terms of reviewing that, looking at the supply chain, it's really about due diligence and policies, reviewing companies where the pressure of lead times is very high, short manufacturing times, and companies in the supply chain where workers are predominantly migrant, minorities, Indigenous groups, or individuals that are typically more vulnerable to exploitation or in poverty.
Thank you, Erin, for your very clear explanation. Here at ISS ESG, we help investors with their stewardship and responsible investing strategies. What tools do we have available for investors that would like to address this specific issue, and how do they work?
Sure. So, in terms of research, there are a couple of different lenses that you can view this issue through. Largely this has been considered a human rights issue, and it's clustered under other human rights, due diligence and management systems. So one of the things to review is at a company level, do they have the policy systems and reporting in place to manage this issue in terms of their supply chain? Do they understand where the risks lie, and if they carried out, clear audits on their supply chain and those operations and monitored those activities for compliance? And if there are failures, have they addressed those? And the other part of that monitoring is obviously allegations and controversies against a company. So some of the areas where we see, modern slavery issues creeping in are around the failures to conduct human rights due diligence, the failure to respect the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to self-determination, children's rights, and issues around labour such as the right to just and favourable conditions of work and health and safety working conditions. So within ISS, the way we look at it is almost like a modern slavery scorecard, taking into account first the risk exposure and what that looked like at a sector and a company and a country level. So whether companies have clear exposure to modern slavery risks. We then look at mitigation of that risk and whether the company has those due diligence processes in place. And lastly, monitoring the effectiveness through their controversies. whether they have allegations and if in those allegations they are looking at remediation and management of those issues in the fastest way possible.
That's great. Thank you for your time, Erin. It was a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Justine, and thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Justine and Erin, for sharing your insights into the global issue of modern slavery. For questions on this episode's topic, feel free to reach out to our experts by email at podcast@iss-esg.com. And to stay up to speed on the latest with ISS ESG, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at ISS ESG. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next time to ISS ESG Foreword.